Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm Heather Fast, the Policy Advocacy Director at the Manitoba Eco Network and a PhD candidate at the University of Manitoba's Natural Resources Institute. Thanks for joining us today for the final event of the Navigating the Law Project Part 2. This project is a partnership between the Manitoba Eco Network, the Public Interest Law Centre, and the University of Winnipeg, and is funded by the Manitoba Law Foundation. Part 2 of the Navigating the Law project continued the work we started in Part 1 and focuses on providing plain language information to activists, lawyers, students, and community members about a variety of environmental law topics through a series of educational events over the last 6 months. Recordings of our previous webinars and related materials are available on the Manitoba Eco Network website. Before I get into the details of today's webinar discussing mining and critical minerals and introduce our wonderful speakers, I'd like to acknowledge the ancestral lands that we are on today. Many of us are joining from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is located on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Dakota peoples, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the shared and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this nation home. We also acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and the need to consider how we can each, in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Today's webinar, titled What's Next for Manitoba? Mining and Critical Minerals, was developed in response to the increasing interest in recent years from government and industry in the extraction and development of critical minerals and other mining projects in Manitoba. We've invited 3 speakers to discuss the regulatory situation and the potential impacts from this sector on the environment and health of local communities. You'll hear some thoughts on changes to law and policy in Manitoba that could strengthen protections for the public and vulnerable communities and gain a better understanding of existing tools like the federal National Pollutant Release Inventory, or NPRI database, that can be used by citizens to inform their engagement in regulatory processes associated with critical minerals and mining. Our 3 panelists today, you'll be hearing for right away. First up, we have Patricia Fitzpatrick. Dr. Fitzpatrick is a professor in the Department of Geography and an instructor in the Masters of Development Practice Indigenous Focus program at the University of Winnipeg. Dr. Fitzpatrick's research focuses on different aspects of environmental governance in Canada. Over the past 20 years, she has been actively involved in 15 regulatory hearings related to mining and/or energy developments. Our second speaker, Katrin DeLay, is a staff lawyer with the Public Interest Law Centre, where she has worked since 2015. In her work, she has represented consumer organizations, disability groups, and equality-seeking groups, as well as First Nations political organizations. Katrin practices mostly in the areas of consumer rights, human rights, and environmental law. She's appeared before a number of boards and tribunals and the Manitoba Court of Appeal. Our final speaker, Jamie Mead, is the Canada Program Co-Lead and Outreach Coordinator of Mining Watch. He leads Mining Watch's work on mining policy development and individual mining projects in Western and Northern Canada. He leads policy reform efforts and provides strategic and technical support to communities affected by mineral exploration and mining projects. He also leads the organization's strategic research and communications, as well as research and advocacy in a number of areas, including mine waste management, mining and Indigenous rights, uranium mining, and environmental assessment policy and practice in Canada. So before I hand things over to Trish, who's ready to go, I'm just going to give a little overview of how things are going to work today. So we're going to hear from our 3 speakers who I just introduced. They'll probably have a bit of back and forth after their presentations, and then we'll move to a little bit of a panel discussion, and then we'll end with some questions from the audience. If you have a question, please put them in the chat, and I'll be watching for them and make sure we bring them up at the end. That's everything from me for now. and I will hand things over to our first presenter, Dr. Fitzpatrick. Over to you, Trish.
Thank you, Heather, for the introduction. Today, I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations, which was acknowledged in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt. As I was preparing this acknowledgement of the land and the people on whose land I am, I was struck by the teachings of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt. And one of those teachings is that the wampum is used as a symbol of the dish to represent the territory. And the spoon represents the people who are to share the resources of the land, and importantly, to only take what they need. I think that's particularly important when we think about mining and critical mining. Over the past few months, there's been significant discussion in Manitoba, across Canada, and arguably the globe about critical minerals. My role in this presentation is to share some basic information about what critical minerals are, and by way of example, what critical minerals should not be, why the designation is significant, and then very briefly illustrate why this is of specific importance in Manitoba. As the PowerPoint begins, I want to acknowledge the work of Leah Portier-Cole, Heather Taylor, and the next speaker, Kachin Delay, for combing through the voluminous policy documents, legislation, databases to bring this information together and illustrate it in a way we hope is accessible. So this first slide, because I don't like title pages, is basically a diagram of grouping types of critical minerals. So critical minerals broadly include three categories. Rare earth elements are grouped or clustered along the periodic table in the lanthanide series. The rare in the name does not necessarily mean that these elements are scarce, but rather that they were, at least at one point in time, difficult to extract. So the lanthanide series have strong electromagnetic and light properties. The platinum group metals are 6 elements on the periodic table. These metals have high melting points, high heat resistance, and high corrosion resistance. And the third category I labeled as political choice. This can include all manner of things deemed important for different reasons, often at the discretion of a political entity. So this can include things like regional abundance, threatened supply chains, etc. What I hope this starts to emerge with this slide and throughout my presentation is there are a wide range of minerals which have been deemed critical by one jurisdiction or another. Next slide, please. So on the slide, there is a Venn diagram which lists the current critical minerals, those deemed critical by Canada or Alberta or Manitoba. So a couple observations I have about this Venn diagram. There are surprisingly a high number of minerals that share the designation of critical by all 3 of the jurisdictions. So there are 19. That's actually a very high number. If we were able to include all the jurisdictions across Canada, the only mineral that has been designated critical is zinc. And of course, zinc is still not a critical mineral across the globe. Australia, the European Union, for example, do not include zinc on their list of critical minerals. What may be surprising for the Manitoba audience is that for all the talk of silica being a critical mineral, neither Alberta nor Canada has declared it so. In fact, the only other jurisdiction in Canada to deem silica critical is New Brunswick. And what might be surprising for anyone who's watching from the Northwest Territories, which has a problem with legacy arsenic, is that arsenic has been deemed critical by Alberta and Manitoba. Next slide. This Venn diagram illustrates the differences between what has been named the most important critical minerals by Canada and Manitoba. So message 1 from this slide is there is no consistency, even with respect to what is considered the most important mineral. And I suppose snarkily, oh, look, Manitoba's doubling down on silica, declaring it critical, most critical. So again, there's little agreement as to what minerals are critical. Next slide, please. Not all jurisdictions have a definition of critical minerals. Typically, you'll find a list, but no explanation specifically of what's included in the list. In fact, Canada is only now working on its definition, despite the fact that we have a list of critical minerals. But here are some prominent aspects which inform some of the definitions used around the world. So one, and I think this one is most expected by the public, is that a critical mineral is necessary for the energy transition. Many definitions also require that that mineral be at high risk for disruption in the supply chain. Many include economic importance to that specific jurisdiction as being important. Several include national security or the role of that mineral in national security as a component. Some focus specifically on the geographic locale, meaning we have it, so we want to be able to exploit it. Others include importance for allies of that mineral. Again, not everyone has a definition. Not all definitions include each of these aspects, but understanding this package I find useful for a few reasons. One, it adds flavor to the third category from my first slide, political choice. And two, it illustrates the myriad of factors considered in getting something on the critical minerals list, including things like we have it, or this brings money to our coffers, and other factors not considered in the designation, like we have a strong recycling system in place to minimize relying on pulling this out of the earth. And so this list of aspects helps perhaps explain the dog's breakfast of critical minerals around the world. Next slide, please. So there's a disconnect. And I think there's a big disconnect from the discussion in the public who think that critical minerals are those which are necessary for the energy transition. Yes, this is important for the designation. If we were to actually focus on minerals that are critical for the energy transition as the definition, we do not need to include things like geographic locale. We don't have to tie it to what's actually available in a jurisdiction, and we can in turn then promote circular economies for things that we identify as being needed. And at the bottom, I say there always needs to be routine reviews to ensure that we're keeping up with technology. Next slide, please. So this diagram illustrates the uses, some of the uses from the top critical minerals in Canada. Lithium, copper, cobalt, and rare earth elements are all important to Canada and the 6 comparator governments that we looked at, the EU, Australia, South Africa, US, and Japan. And why designation is important is that it comes with significant economic investment in exploration and development of mines. There's significant investment in technology. There's significant tax incentives for exploration. And there's persistent pressure to expedite the approval process, including continued talk on improving the efficiency of the regulatory system, which is code word for decrease the timelines. Canada has a long history of the boom bust nature of primary resource development, including mining. And when will we apply the lessons that we've learned again and again over the years? Slide 7. Next slide. Thank you. This one. This is a map that captures all of the active licenses and claims as of January 15th, 2024. You might be surprised to know that there are only 3 active mines in Manitoba and 3 under care and maintenance. So blue is active mines, magenta is care and maintenance. Yellow is near-term development, and there are 7 of those. Tan is mineral exploration licenses, and there are 186 separate licenses in the database. Gray identifies specific claims. So there are over 2,800 specific claims. So you'll see that we do have important interest in what happens with critical minerals. Final slide, please. Last week, there was a press conference where the government chose to turn down the proposed silica project. And this quotation is taken from Premier Canoe. And he suggests that in order to have a successful critical mineral strategy in our province, we need to bring minerals to market with higher environmental standards, higher respect for human rights, and higher labor standards than any other provincial jurisdiction. This is a heady challenge, but one I hope we can help him achieve. Thank you.
Thanks, Trish. Great presentation. I see we have a question, and Jamie is perhaps typing the answer. Would you want to respond to it now, or should we save it to the end? What do you think, Trish? You're muted.
I will save it to the end so I can look up the specific number of jurisdictions that have identified uranium, because it's not very many. Thank you.
Sounds good. Then I think we'll move on to our next presenter. And I'll hand it over to Katrin.
Thanks, Heather, for the introduction, and thank you for having me. As Heather indicated, my name is Katrine DeLay, and I'm a lawyer with the Public Interest Law Centre, also referred to as PILC. We're an independent office of Legal Aid Manitoba. PILC practices in 4 main areas of law, including environmental law, human rights, consumer rights, and the law relating to Indigenous peoples. And of course, the focus of my presentation today will be on Manitoba's critical minerals strategy, and I'll talk a little bit about what's missing from the current strategy and what could be or should be included in a renewed provincial critical mineral strategy. And I'll just apologize for my voice. I'm just getting over a cold, so it's a little bit scratchy still today. Slide 2, please. So in terms of a brief roadmap for my presentation, I'll first touch on Manitoba's current critical mineral strategy. Then I'll turn to the October 2023 mandate letter to Manitoba's Minister of Economic Development, Investment, Trade, and Natural Resources, where reference was included to a real critical mineral strategy. And then in the last part of my presentation, I'll touch upon what could or should be included in a real critical mineral strategy. Slide 3, please. So in July of 2023, Manitoba released its new critical minerals strategy, and I just included the cover page here on this slide. It's entitled Driving Sustainable Growth. And a review of the strategy shows that the strategy's main theme is that Manitoba is open for business when it comes to mining. The strategy recognizes that Manitoba is well positioned to be a global competitor as a critical and strategic mineral supplier with significant critical mineral potential in the province. Unfortunately, our review of the strategy shows that it falls significantly short. The high-level priorities for Manitoba that are identified in the strategy were developed without an established public consultation process, and it also lacks the necessary detail to adequately set the stage for expanded mining activities in the province. So very specifically, some of the gaps and weaknesses that have been identified with the strategy include that there's no plan to update Manitoba's legislative framework relating to mining to reflect the open for business perspective and as well as to reflect and address our antiquated laws. Greenhouse gases or green energy requirements are not included. There's currently no mention of the duty to consult or Indigenous peoples or Indigenous groups in the Mines and Minerals Act. In the strategy, there's no mention of the protection of watercourses, and there's insufficient biodiversity and wildlife protection. We also see a lack of information about the protection of communities or community continuation plans following mine abandonment. And finally, there's no mention of public involvement in the legislative framework, despite in the strategy having a commitment to foster robust and transparent government, industry, and Indigenous collaboration. Next slide, please. So the current government, which as we know was elected in October 2023, appears to have recognized some, at least, of the shortcomings in the previous government's critical mineral strategy. In fact, the mandate letter for the new Minister of Economic Development, Investment, Trade and Natural Resources, released in October 2023, refers to the need for a real critical mineral strategy. So from our perspective, that's a promising opportunity. They're willing to look again at Manitoba's critical mineral strategy. But it's only a promising opportunity if it's done right. And so as a starting point, we would want to see meaningful public engagement, including with industry, with the public at large, with non-governmental organizations and Indigenous nations and organizations on renewing the critical mineral strategy. However, and unfortunately, there's no evidence of this public engagement to date. Slide 5, please. So I don't want to repeat the really great context that Dr. Fitzpatrick provided in her presentation. But in terms of Manitoba's landscape, it's important to note that time is pressing when it comes to our critical mineral strategy, legislation, and regulatory framework. As Dr. Fitzpatrick indicated, mining industry is expanding and also shifting its focus due to the transition to a low carbon economy. And so as she talked about, Manitoba has seen a substantial increase in mineral exploration. And another recent indication is there was $1.3 million in funding granted to the Manitoba Mining Association to market Manitoba's critical minerals globally. So time is pressing. And so moving on to the next slide, what should a real critical mineral strategy consider? So we propose that it should definitely include meaningful public engagement on the critical mineral strategy, and also that there are opportunities for Manitoba to both lead by example and also to learn from other jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So in terms of opportunities to lead by example, an updated provincial critical mineral strategy should be grounded in 4 interrelated and overarching considerations. And this approach that we're proposing here is based on our review of critical mineral strategies in other jurisdictions, the literature on critical minerals, as well as our work in other areas of the law, including consumer rights, human rights, and Indigenous rights. So the 4 considerations that we're proposing is the environment, which should include adequate environmental impact assessments and protections for our environment. The second consideration is social impacts, which includes advancing mineral development in a way that's more equitable and that recognizes the social impacts of mining, including on groups who have historically been disproportionately negatively impacted by mining. The third consideration is economic impacts. And so by this, we talk about broadly for the province of Manitoba, as well as for specific communities, which could see impacts on employment and economic growth, but also including consideration of more equitable ways of sharing resources and a focus on a circular economy. So not just looking at extraction, pulling minerals out of the ground, but also looking at the process for production, for the uses of these minerals, and a focus on recycling opportunities. And finally, the fourth consideration is reconciliation and Indigenous worldviews and knowledge. And this consideration and recognition should be built into every step, including the criteria for establishing critical minerals and into strategies for guiding investment and prioritizing decision-making to support supply chains. And so, of course, these considerations are different, but we've put them in a Venn diagram to recognize that they are also all interrelated. Next slide, please. And so, keeping in mind those 4 overarching considerations, Manitoba also has opportunities to learn from other jurisdictions, specifically what has worked and what has not worked in other jurisdictions. So this could be the topic of a whole article or a whole book, but just to provide a few specific examples. Opportunities for public engagement should be built into an updated Manitoba critical mineral strategy. And we've seen this in other jurisdictions. For example, Canada just finished a federal public consultation on the criteria it uses to deem a mineral as critical. And the Yukon, in its discussion paper on critical minerals, includes several methods that could be utilized for the public to be involved in approvals. Updating and amending mining legislative framework, including plans for legislating reforms that aligns mining practices with strong environmental protection and mechanisms and commitments to Indigenous peoples. And so without commenting on the substance of the amendments, Ontario would be an example of a province that has recently amended its mining framework. Investing in Indigenous engagement in natural resource projects. Again, without commenting on the details, Alberta has done at least a little bit of this. And finally, consideration of workplace violence and harassment that has disproportionately and continues to affect Indigenous people, women, and minorities. And this should be considered when looking at socioeconomic considerations for updated legislation, and the Yukon has at least begun to acknowledge this. There's, of course, a lot of other examples, such as more thorough consideration of cumulative impacts, royalty reform, adequate financial sureties after mining activities are done, but I'll leave it at that for now. On the next slide, I just want to briefly touch upon a recent mining application by CO Silica for a silica sand mine in southeastern Manitoba. And as Trish alluded to, this application was recently denied by the government of Manitoba last Friday, which we see as a good news story for the communities who could have seen a significant and negative impact on their drinking water. So while we've seen a positive outcome, the process has been illustrative of some of the current challenges in Manitoba's mining framework. So I'll just kind of highlight 4 of them in terms of the challenges we've seen. First is that the approach to the licensing application was allowed to proceed as a bifurcated process. So the company was allowed to apply for its processing plant and its extraction activities separately, which really limits the ability of the regulator to look at cumulative impacts, so the whole impact of the project. So secondly, it was significant and really important that the project proceeded to a public hearing before the Clean Environment Commission. But one challenge that remained was that there was no commentary from the mines branch, which was a really important voice that should have been included at the public hearing process. And again, relating to the public hearing, there was no participant funding. And so non-governmental organizations and the public in general was put at a disadvantage in terms of its participation in the public hearing. And finally, prior to issuing its decision, the government had announced that it was conducting a further technical review of the project, which raised some questions regarding transparency and accountability of the decision-making process, because that technical review was not being made public and was done behind closed doors. So those are just some examples of the challenges that we see under our current mining legislative and regulatory framework. And so next slide. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. That was great. And we will pass it off to our final presenter then, Jamie. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Heather. So there's my slides coming up. So I was asked to talk specifically about pollution and the National Pollutant Release Inventory. And just as a way of explaining, the National Pollutant Release Inventory is something that exists under the federal, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And so it's a registry of releases of pollutants from industrial operations of any significant size. So anything bigger than like a dry cleaner, a certain number of employees, certain amount of material, releases to the air, to the water, or to the land. So dumping of any kind really is included. Next slide, please. And so it's a bit funny because the SEPA definitions of toxic are not just what's toxic, what's bad for you, or what's bad for the environment. It, as a whole, the chemicals industry made sure that there was a whole rigmarole attached to this to ensure that things are very specifically identified as toxic. And so it's a bit cumbersome. And of course, with tens of thousands of chemicals in the environment, it's a little bit daunting to try and list them all and characterize them all and get the toxicology for all of them to justify even reporting them, because this is not regulatory. This is just a reporting mechanism. But it does serve useful purposes. for communities. And now that the mining industry, which was excluded from reporting mysteriously for the first few years of the implementation of the inventory, we can look at mining facilities, and we can look at air and water emissions that are reported, but also mine waste, tailings, and waste rock that are deposited on the landscape. And so that allows us to do a couple of things. One is just identify the risks, like what is coming out of these places, or what is being released into the environment, you know, in the broader air and water catchments of the facility. And so what are the health risks and the environmental risks, and what cleanup measures might need to be taken? So if we see something that's alarming in there, and it's not being looked after, then we can push for actual cleanups. It also provides us with a record of the liability. So how much is actually being dumped, and in terms of solid waste, in terms of waste rock and tailings, what they call on-site releases. So this is material that is not being dumped into the environment at large, but it's being dumped in the environment, in a pile, behind a dam, in a storage facility of some kind, that then, because these are materials that have now been dug out of the ground and crushed up and processed, are at risk of releasing acid and heavy metals into the environment. And so that allows us to identify the potential risks, look at the long-term impacts, because you know, these are materials that are not going to go anywhere over the next centuries and millennia, and then identify measures to minimize and manage those risks. Next slide, please. So this has some implications for planning. You know, this helps us provide a context for regional planning and processes like environmental assessment. We can look at cumulative impacts. We can look at how much of a liability is being created, how much risk is already exists in, you know, in various dimensions, so water and land. We can look at the precedents, the established practices, and the pitfalls, or the less than good practices for pollution and safe management of those pollutants. And we can look at the financial securities for cleanup. And so, you know, what kind of performance bonds need to be in place to ensure that if something goes wrong, or if the operator goes bankrupt, that the money will be there to pay for the cleanup. But it also lets us identify the limits of cleanup, because there are places and circumstances where cleanup is not possible. And often we do find, especially with things like spills, like once something's gone into a river or a wetland, often the best thing to do is actually to leave it there and hope it settles and doesn't mobilize into the water column or into the groundwater, because actually often trying to clean it up will make it worse. So there's, you know, after a little while, there's real limits to this, and we try to minimize that. And that would allow us to identify places that protection should be in place, and maybe a little bit harder edged than we're used to in our regulatory environment. Next slide, please. So I want to take a quick look at the NPRI for the mining sector in Manitoba. This includes mining and smelting, and so you'll see the big blue blocks on this chart are from a facility identified as number 1473, which is Vale Thompson. So that's the smelter, and kind of looks like it shut down in 2018, which I think is the reality. And so the emissions just decreased radically from that facility, but other facilities keep going. And then next slide, please. And then we can look at what those substances are. And sure enough, you see that there's a huge chunk of SO2, sulfur dioxide, again, from the Thompson smelter, that are really the bulk of releases from the mining sector, and also really nasty stuff. So that's just going into the air. But then we look at some of these other elements that are going into water or being transferred on land, we'll see that there's a range of them, and I don't think they all make it onto the legend of this chart, but there's a number of toxic and heavy metals included there. If you're looking at this online, if you go to the National Pollutant Release Inventory dashboard, you can pull up these different ways of looking at the data, and you can click your way through to, you know, which facility, which substance, and it'll provide more details on each one. Next slide, please. And so then, you know, again, we look at this in more detail, and you can see it'll show you a table of what the actual numbers are. So you can look at over time what's being released from different facilities in different ways. So that, you know, again, that sort of gives us a picture of what's going on out there that lets us consider what we might want to do in terms of planning for the future. I've got a couple of other examples. Next slide, please, where we were able to use this data in a couple of cases. So one was the Obed Mountain mine spill in Alberta, where there was a slurry waste impoundment collapsed and dumped 670 million liters of waste into the Athabasca River watershed. And the map just sort of shows, I think in the upper right corner, it's a little hard to make out in this. 2013 is a long time ago. The technology's gotten a lot better, but you know, you can still see where there's a blob of waste that isn't supposed to be there, and the Athabasca River flows by the lower corner of the image, and you know, well within range of the spill. So next slide, please. So if we look at what's in that, we could say, oh, there's a few things we might want to worry about, and really pay attention to testing downstream to see if those are spreading, and that might, again, there might be limits to what we can do to divert or contain that material. But we can try some of those, and we can also just monitor and take action on individual contaminants and causes of concern downstream. Next slide, please. Another one, which actually I think also shows some of the limitations of this approach, is the Mount Poly mine spill, which you know, in 2014, 1.7 million cubic meters of wastewater from the mine waste from the tailings pond at Mount Poly spilled, and you can see on the sort of going out to the right where that just blew out Hazeltine Creek completely and ended up dumping waste into right into Quesnel Lake, which is on the right of the image. Next slide, please. And if we look at this, we see that there's you know, a few things. Copper is problematic for fish. It's not that toxic in itself, but it messes up the development of fish embryos. And so you get fish with deformations and things like deformed gills. So if you're a fish, that's kind of awkward, and not just socially but functionally. Things like vanadium, phosphorus, manganese that are also dangerous. Again, this material is now at the bottom of Mount Poly and being monitored, the extent to which it is being mobilized season over season into the water column in Quesnel Lake. But at least we have some idea of what we're looking at. And I've just pulled up some of the toxicity measurements here and showing that the copper in terms of aquatic life was extremely nasty at different points. So next slide, please. That'll show that. You see the chronic and acute guidelines for copper at 2 and 7 micrograms per liter, respectively, and you know, several orders of magnitude higher than that below the breach, and still above the limits when you get into the opening of Hazeltine Creek into Quesnel Lake. One of the interesting things there is that there were things like a bit of a plankton bloom visible in Quesnel Lake after the spill, which, you know, we didn't see any nitrogen. There was some phosphorus, but no nitrogen in the effluent, and it later turned out that, as often happens with mines and tailings dumps, they were dumping all kinds of stuff in there, not just what was reported in the National Pollutant Release Inventory, but biosolids. So they were shipping sewage waste from the Lower Mainland that was supposed to be used in remediation, supposed to be sort of treated and composted and used it for remediation at the mine site. But for whatever reason, they just dumped a bunch of it in the tailings pond. Old machinery, like basically any kind of garbage that they want to get rid of, they can just dump it in the tailings pond and cover it over with mine tailings, and nobody will ever know. So that explains some of the discrepancies that we saw in terms of the observed environmental impacts of the spill. And again, while the NPRI is useful in characterizing those materials, obviously there's limits if there are things there that aren't reported. And yeah, so next slide, please. So if we extend this to looking at the question of critical minerals, I guess a couple of things emerge, and Trish and Katrin have both alluded to some of these aspects, and one is just the industry's push for increased, accelerated, and expanded mining under the guise or under the banner of trying to save the climate. And what we see, and looking at the lists of critical minerals, what's considered critical and why, well, that's actually a small portion of it. And even when you look at specific metals and minerals that are used for the energy transition, in many cases that use is a small portion of the overall demand. So if we say, oh, well, we need a lot of copper for the energy transition, well, copper's in all kinds of things. And how much of the construction and electrical system is attributable to a renewable energy transition is kind of questionable. And then there's others that are used, considered critical because they're used in weapons. And of course, we really need weapons in order to preserve us from the effects of climate change. So there's, we see expanded and intensified mining for traditional metals like nickel, lead, and zinc. We see mining for new metals, new minerals like lithium, graphite, silica sand, and rare earths. And we're also seeing a push for mining in new areas and staking claims, and then followed by development rushes in different areas, areas without a mining vocation, which means places where there aren't mines, where there isn't infrastructure, where people are not used to mining, and maybe where the land uses are not compatible with mining. Maybe people are using that for recreation, for agriculture, for harvesting, and where mining is really not going to be convenient. And then the measures to expedite mining. So again, some of these have been discussed in terms of trying to deregulate essentially and speed up mining and add subsidies and public support. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna stop there because I think I'm running out of time. But I just want to say that there are some limitations to the use of the NPRI, and then we can look at the application of that within the critical mineral sphere. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks, Jamie. Very, very interesting presentation. Okay, so we have an excellent question that we just got from the audience. So we've gotten a question from Dre, who's from Hollowwater First Nation. And this is a question for all three panelists. And this was actually along the lines of the question I was going to ask myself, which is, so if you're a citizen and you're facing a situation like this, we know there's lots of communities in Manitoba now that are being approached by mining companies or seeing things happening in their area. What as a citizen are the types of resources or things that a member of the public could access to help them? So Jamie just gave us an excellent example of the NPRI database, but especially for people in Manitoba, where this is kind of new to some of us, what would be your recommendation if you're a citizen facing this type of information?
I think the first place to start, if you're worried about a specific mining project or a new development, you can check the Manitoba Public Registry. The main page will say if there's a project that is being reviewed, and you can have an opportunity to present feedback. If you're not able to check that public registry, the Manitoba Eco Network produces a newsletter where Heather checks the public registry for us on a fairly regular basis. If it's an existing mine in Manitoba, we don't always know from the new project file if they filed an amendment. So if there's a mine that you're particularly concerned about that has been approved, you need to go back and check that file on a fairly regular basis. So for example, we've been following the Tanko file for the last year or so, and which means we have to specifically go to the database, check to see if anything's been added. Once there is, send in a letter, send in an appeal. So those are some resources for new projects or project amendments. And now I'll pass it off to Katrin.
Thanks. So in addition to that, I mean, I think that's in terms of information and sort of legal pathways, what Trish has alluded to is really important. You know, in terms of legal representation, PILC, Public Interest Law Center, has represented organizations in the past. For example, we represented Our Line in the Sand and Manitoba Eco Network in the Clean Environment Commission proceeding related to the CO silica application. However, I mean, given resources and sort of the impact of certain mines, you know, we can't be involved in everything. But if there is something that folks think that is systemic and will impact a large segment of the population and where legal representation is needed, you know, you're of course welcome to approach PILC and see what, if any, assistance we might be able to provide.
And yeah, I'll jump in as well, because I think one of the things really is, you know, in addition to that kind of specific information, talking to people. So see, you know, talk to people in the community, talk to people around you, see who knows what kind of concerns or ideas they might be having about, you know, whatever the issue is. Because then you get a sense of, you know, not just what the issues are, but how people feel about it. And it's kind of the first step to actually doing anything about it, because, you know, I think the legal avenues and the public representations are really important, but they also have to be based on something. I mean, you need a plaintiff to launch a lawsuit. You need an organization of some kind to stand up to these things, and so I think that's really critical. And I mean, a lot of what we do is as Mining Watch, and that goes to Dre's question as well. You know, I think like everyone here, we're kind of run off our feet. There's way too much going on for us to be able to respond. There's only a handful of us working on this. But the more we can connect with others and pool our resources and exchange information, then the better chance we have of being effective in intervening, finding resources for communities. You know, not necessarily being the resource, but helping find the resources and putting things together. So that's sort of my pitch on that.
Great answer. I'm glad you plugged your organization as well, JB, because there's some great resources on the Mining Watch website that are very helpful. So we've actually, the time has flown by, so I am just going to finish up with one question. There are a couple additional questions that we will have to follow up with. Sorry if we didn't get to your question, audience members. So there was a question that I'm not entirely sure what your answer will be, but I'll throw it out there as it's something we're struggling with. But basically, it was a question about the kind of complexities of those different elements you were pointing out in your Venn diagrams and how we actually deal with the trade-offs and figure out how it all fits together. So I just wanted to know if you had a question about how I know this is something we've all been advocating for in our recent federal submission, but if you have any additional thoughts, Katrin, on how to deal with those different complexities and making sure some of them get the emphasis that they deserve, such as the Indigenous worldview and knowledge piece of things.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. I think that question is referring to the sort of 4 considerations in the Venn diagram, referring to the economy, reconciliation, social impacts, and the environment, which are, of course, all interrelated. I mean, I think we were encouraged by Premier Kinu's speech or some of his comments last week in terms of having really high standards when it comes to the environment and protection of communities and the health of people. And so I think at this point in time, what we would like to see is a public evidence-based process in terms of developing a critical mineral strategy that will impact all Manitobans, and seeing what the evidence recommends based on what other jurisdictions are doing and how things are progressing. So what we don't want to see is business as usual with antiquated laws, as well as an industry that's kind of always progressing. So we'd want to see an evidence-based process and a chance for the public to also provide their input.
Just jump in here, reflecting on Jamie's last answer. I would note that as we've dived back into thinking about critical minerals, I've learned so much from my colleagues and listening and thinking about different perspectives. And so I've had so much learning over 6 months. There were things that we originally didn't set out to consider, which we absolutely should have. So it's only by listening can we think about the different components, to hear people's perspective and to think about a pathway forward. And so it's very important for a public process to happen, and it needs to be transparent and give an opportunity for people to have dialogue and share perspectives.
Jamie, anything else to add?
Hard to top that. Thanks, Trish.
Okay, well,
Shout out to you.
Shout out to all of our wonderful speakers who have lots of valuable thoughts to share with people in the upcoming years. So I think that's where we will end today, because I think any additional questions will take longer to answer than we have. We can follow up with any additional questions that haven't been answered. And this is a topic that we hope to engage on for the next while. So hopefully you'll be hearing more from us. Dylan, if you wanted to put up our QR code, perfect. So just in closing, I really want to say thanks to our panelists who gave wonderful presentations today. We will be posting their slides on the website along with the recording, just so everyone knows. So we would very much appreciate if you could fill out the survey we have for today's event. You can access it via the QR code that Dylan is displaying. A survey link is also going to be sent to your email after the webinar finishes. Please fill it out so we can get some feedback on the event today and hear from you about topics you'd like to see discussed in the future. As I mentioned, the recording and other materials will be available on the Manitoba Eco Network website, and information about future events can be found on the Manitoba Eco Network website and will be included in upcoming Eco Network publications. I'd also encourage you to check out the Mining Watch website, as there's lots of good information on this topic there. So thanks so much for attending. I hope you have a great rest of your day and hope to see you soon. Thanks, everyone.